Chapter 9 Chief Looking Glass. Lisha had made one loyal friend in the Sioux village, a young Crow girl. While he worked with the squaws day after day gathering wood, he pitied the captive girl, and whenever he could, he eased the heavy burdens forced upon her. He often caught the furtive looks that the Crow girl gave him and thought he detected sympathy in her lowered black eyes. One night, while his Indian guard slept, and Alicia lay awake, listening to their snoring and trying to plan some way of escape, he heard the slightest of sounds. Then he felt small hands on his wrists, then on his ankles. He realized that his midnight visitor could be none other than the captive Crow maiden. She had cut through the stout leather thongs that bound him. Now she took his hand, and he knew that she wished him to follow her. Silent as two shadows, they crept outside the lodge. Then the girl released his hand. "Now you go," she said. "Someday you remember Crow Girl." He slipped through the darkness to the edge of the village. His heart beat so loudly with the excited joy of being free at last that he thought the sleeping Indians might hear it. If he could only get away from the lodges without discovery, he might have many hours head start of his pursuers. Certainly no one would find out until morning. Just as he thought, he reached a safe distance. A snooping dog began to bark. Other dogs took up the alarm and joined in a crescendo of furious noise. Lisha still hoped that the village would not be aroused. The dogs often barked at night at each other, coyotes, and many times at nothing at all. Then he heard voices and a commotion among the lodges. Men rushed about that the thieving crows were after the horses. Lisha ran for the brush that lay along the water's edge. It seemed to him that every dog in the village had come awake to wild barking, and all of them ran hot on his heels. He plunged into the water near the trunk of a giant cottonwood tree that had toppled into the creek. He saw a wild parsnip growing at the edge of the stream and broke off a stalk. Then he climbed over the fallen tree trunk and crouched back under it as far as he could. If the Indians came too close, he would submerge and use the parsnip stalk for a breathing tube. This was a common trick among the Indians, and they would certainly spot him unless he held it close enough to the tree trunk so they could not discover it. Then he heard the Indians approaching. He knew from what they had said that they had seen his tracks at the water's edge, and knew that he could not be far away. Ducking under the water, he worked himself farther back under the cottonwood log. He lay still as a stone and put the parsnip stalk in his mouth, being careful to hold it up among the branches. Breathing through the stalk was not easy. He had to press his lips tight around the stalk and be careful not to wiggle it. An Indian waded out to the log and climbed over it. He almost stepped on Lisha, who compelled himself to absolute stillness. Finally, all sounds died away. The Indians must have gone on down the creek. With deliberate caution, he pushed his head out of the water, straightened up, and looked in every direction. Nothing. No one. He swam across the creek and ran for the hills on the opposite side. Once in the hilly area, he raced to cover as much distance as possible before daybreak. When morning came and daylight began to redden the sky, Lucius searched for a place to hide. He dared not travel or show himself by daylight. even at night he might be discovered. He had lost his moccasins in the creek, and his feet hurt from the sharp rocks and the rough ground he had traveled over during the dark hours. He hid himself in a thick clump of sagebrush that stood waist high. He could not keep strict count of the time, but he knew that months had passed since Indians had captured him. Autumn had come and the nights felt chilly. With no clothing but the buckskin breechcloth, he huddled in the sagebrush and rested as much as he could until sundown. Then the next morning came. When the next morning came, he looked down at himself. He felt his long matted hair. His skin had browned until he looked more Indian than white. Suppose he did manage to find his way back to the settlements. Would anyone accept him? Would his own brother know him? And what chance did he have for survival? Spent with effort, hungry and thirsty, one man against the whole hostile Yellowstone country, how could he still hope? Then he remembered how God had heard his prayer and delivered him from death on the anthill and healed his wounded shoulder. With new determination, he secluded himself in some shelter, morning after freezing morning. By night, he forced himself across the prairie, through washes and buffalo wallows. He ate wild fruit and drank at streams he crossed. Every day he hid, and every night he traveled to the limit of his strength, always taking care that no skulking Indian discovered him. At last he staggered into one of Nelson Story's cattle camps on the Yellowstone, and he knew that he had won his freedom. Yet he knew that without God's intervention, he could never have done that. Although sick from starvation and exposure, he still lived. Mitch Boyer, an intrepid Indian scout, came to look at him. He reached out and touched Lish's tangled hair. Man, you must have been through hell. The cowboy sent word to Elliot that his brother had escaped from the Indians. In no time at all, it seemed, Elliot, driving his horses at breakneck speed, swung into the cattle camp. Oh, Lish, I thought you were dead. His voice broke. Never had Lisha loved and valued his brother so much as this moment of meeting. Elliot had brought a comfortable wagon so that Lisha could ride home with as little jolting as possible. All the way back to Bozeman, he entertained Elliot with the account of his adventures in the Sioux camp. When he told him about how God had delivered him that night on the anthill, Elliot looked at him with a questioning, worried expression. Lisha could see that Elliot wondered if perhaps he was still a little mad from all he had suffered. When the Rouse brothers rolled into Bozeman, almost the whole town turned out to welcome them. For the first time, Lisha realized how many friends he had and what good friends. He had left on his scouting assignment for the Army in mid-June. Now October was half gone. Under Elliot's loving care, Susan's kind attention, and the tenderness of his sister Helen, Lisha's normal, healthy body soon recovered, and his joy of life returned along with all his enthusiasm. He had learned valuable lessons from his 4-month ordeal. He now knew a great deal about the Sioux Indians, their language, customs, superstitions, and manners. But most important of all, he had met the living God that terrible night on the anthill, and he knew now that God had charge of people's lives, and that he cared personally for Lisha Rouse. Indians from most of the tribes in western Montana and northern Idaho visited Bozeman. The stores in the flourishing town offered all the things the Indians wanted: guns, powder, lead for ammunition. More and more Indians came to Bozeman to buy warm clothing for winter. They learned to like flour, sugar, coffee, and other of the white men's foodstuffs. The merchants welcomed the Indian trade. Clusters of lodges came to be usual sight around the outskirts of town. Sometimes the Indians camped along the mouth of Bridger Creek north of town, and sometimes on the east side of Bozeman. Whenever the townspeople saw a large band of Indians approaching, they sent Lisha out to discover their intentions. Were they interested in friendly trade or something else? Some of the Indians became good friends of the businessmen in town. Others proved to be arrogant and demanding. One day an Indian came to the blacksmith shop where Billy Lee worked at shoeing a horse for Nelson Story. He demanded that Billy leave what he was doing and shoe his horse at once. Billy looked at him and said, "You must wait your turn with the others. Several men are ahead of you." The Indian reached for his gun, but in a flash, Billy Lee drew his own weapon and shot the Indian dead. Licious felt sure that the Indian could have known nothing about Billy Lee, or he would never have laid hand on his gun. Billy enjoyed the reputation of the fastest gun in the territory. One day, a large number of Indians began to set up their lodges at the end of Main Street on Bozeman's east side. The scouts found out that these Nez Perce Indians had followed their chief, Looking Glass, on a journey from Idaho. They intended to camp near Bozeman to do some trading. 250 lodges sprang up that evening, and the next day the Indians streamed into town to engage in some brisk trading. Although the law forbade the sale of liquor to Indians, some of the young bucks got hold of firewater somewhere, and that night they made a great disturbance, fighting, yelling, and shooting off their guns. The noise alarmed the residents on the town's east side. The following day, a public meeting convened to discuss the disquieting events of the night before. Some of the men, alarmed and angry, made fiery speeches and demanded that the Indians be forced to leave the area at once. The merchants and others disagreed. Business had been slow and they needed the Indian trade. They urged some peaceful solution to the problem. Some of the wiser among them began to question where the Indians had obtained the illegal liquor. No one seemed to know. Not one person would admit to having given any Indian whiskey or even having seen an Indian drinking whiskey. They compromised at last by appointing a committee to take their grievance to Chief Looking Glass and to request him to keep his people out of town after dark. Those who had met the chief believed that he would cooperate, and that difficulty would be settled by peaceful negotiation. Cooper, operator of the gun shop in Bozeman, led the delegation that sallied forth to the Indian camp. Cooper had met the chief, and he also had a good understanding of Indian ways and customs. The chief came forward to meet his visitors and shook hands in cordial welcome. He called someone to come out and act as interpreter, and they conducted the three men into the camp. Here he showed them two splendid racehorses. Chief Looking Glass explained that he intended to race his horses against the best racing stock the Crow could offer. Then he showed them his war horse, a beautiful white horse. He told them about other fine horses in his herd. Over an hour passed before the chief prepared himself to find out the white men's business. He took them into his council lodge, ordered buffalo robes to be placed for them to sit on and produced a peace pipe. The chief lighted it, took a puff or two, and passed it along until it had gone around the circle. Now the chief signaled that he wanted to hear what they had come to say. Cooper explained in detail the drunken brawl of the previous night and how it had frightened the white families in the neighborhood. He drew out some knives and an old Navy revolver that had been picked up that morning on the ground where the fight had taken place. He concluded with a request that the chief would instruct his young men to stay out of the town after dark. The chief's old face darkened, and a frown appeared. He looked sad. He sat in silence, and long moments passed before he spoke. The men looked at the chief's powerful frame. He had the body and bearing of an athlete, yet dignity and poise marked his every movement. His moments of meditation ended. He began to speak soft and pleasant words. Bozeman is the last place my people can buy sugar, flour, coffee, and clothing for the winter. We need powder and lead for our guns. He turned to Cooper. We must have guns to defend ourselves from the Sioux and to kill game for food and for robes. The Indian needs the buffalo. The flesh is his food, and the skin keeps him warm in the winter. Now the chief's voice rose. I am sorry that our young men disturbed your people. You are our friends. You say my young men behaved like fools? They may do foolish things when they are out of my sight. I cannot watch them every moment. Chief Looking Glass shifted his position until he looked directly into the white faces before him. His black eyes flashed with piercing fire, and his voice took a sharpness they had not heard before. There is no firewater in my camp. We brought no firewater with us. I am told that the big chief of the city, the governor, has a book that talks. Books say white men must not give firewater to Indians, must not sell firewater to Indian. He paused for a moment and looked at each of the three men separately. You are our friends. I know you would not do this bad thing, but other men in this town do something different. They do not all sleep at same time. White men on your street do not walk straight. They must have got firewater. Do all your people know of the big chief's book? If they know, why do they give firewater to my young men to make them fools? He sat back, his anger spent, his voice quieted. My friends, you have wigwams where you live and work. You cannot see what all people in your town are doing. You must have bad men who do not care about the words in the big chief's book. My young men brought no firewater to your town. Your people must have given it to them to make them fools. He thrust out his hand in a gesture of command. Go back to your town. Find those people who have forgotten the words of the big chief's book and take the firewater away from them. I will see that my young men are fools no more, and that you will be glad to see them when they come back in the spring and for many years to come. A mask of sadness settled over the chief's noble features. I have forbidden my young men to drink firewater, and my heart is dead when I find they have forgotten my words. Looking Glass has spoken. The delegation from Bozeman rose and shook the chief's hand. They thanked him for his words of wise counsel and carried back the news that Chief Looking Glass would do his part in keeping peace and order. Lisha thought that taking the firewater from the men who had made a practice of giving it to the Indians would be difficult. However, Bozeman suffered no more from the rowdysome of drunken Indians.